And this is the meaning of justice, that we have to invest all necessary efforts to investigate what happened with all people affected by this war, because life of each person matters. And while this war turns people into the numbers, only justice can return people their name.
Welcome to the Lawyering Peace interview series, where we explore the art of diplomacy and the legal frameworks that underpin peace processes. You are listening to our special series focused on peace negotiations and peace building in Ukraine. Join us as we hear from prominent figures who have played pivotal roles as lawyers, negotiators, diplomats in the quest for peace in Ukraine. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Williams, the president and the founder of the Public International Law and Policy Group, and the Rebecca Grazier Professor of Law and International Relations at American University. Now, in recent months, there has been significant movement regarding negotiations to end Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. With our guests, we will explore some of the key issues and challenges that will arise during these negotiations and possible options for tackling these head-on. You'll hear from Ukrainian and international experts on issues ranging from territorial integrity and post-conflict elections to transitional justice, accountability, the crime of aggression, negotiating security guarantees, and providing for reparations and repurposing of frozen Russian assets. Today, it is my exceptional honor to welcome Oleksandra Matviichuk. Welcome to the program, Oleksandra.
Thank you for invitation.
Now, Oleksandra, as all of our listeners know, is a human rights lawyer and a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, and she's the current head of the Center for Civil Liberties. Oleksandra is a leading figure in the protection of human rights in Ukraine and in the broader OSCE region. She was recognized in 2022 as one of the 25 most influential women in the world. Oleksandra is also a member of the steering committee of the World Movement for Democracy. And today we will draw upon Oleksandra's extensive expertise to discuss the pursuit of justice and accountability in Ukraine for the crimes that have arisen from Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. So let's begin. Oleksandra, 3 years after the Center for Civil Liberties became the first Ukrainian organization to win the Nobel Peace Prize, as a strong female leader living and working in a wartime country, how has this journey changed you, both publicly and personally?
For decades, the voice of human rights defenders from Ukraine wasn't heard. For decades, we told that country, which grossly violate human rights, persecute journalists, killed activists, disperse peaceful demonstrations, provide a threat not just for their own citizens, but to the neighbors and to peace and security in general. But the world closed their eyes for everything what Russia was doing. They closed their eyes how Russia destroying their civil society step by step. And this led to situation what we have for current moment. So Nobel Peace Prize provide us as a human rights defenders an opportunity to be heard.
Oleksandra, let's follow up on that a little bit in terms of the Ukrainian notion of justice. Now, there's probably not one homogeneous notion of justice throughout Ukraine, but in different countries, there's different perspectives, different desires, and I'm sure throughout the Ukrainian population, there's different thoughts and ideas on justice. Can you share with us sort of a general perspective as how Ukrainians approach justice, and if there's 3 or 4 or 5 different ways in which the Ukrainian population thinks about justice?
I work with people affected by this war directly, and I know for sure that people see justice very differently. For some people, justice means to seize their perpetrators behind the bars. For another people, justice means to get compensations, and without it, that they feel unsatisfied. For some people, justice means just to know a truth, what happened with their beloved ones. For another people, justice means just a possibility to be publicly heard and to get this public recognition that something which happened with them and their families is not just immoral, but also illegal. And that is why we have to develop the comprehensive justice strategy to reach all these different needs of different people. But let me also illustrate this with one story. This is a story of 62-year-old Oleksandr Shelipov. He was killed by Russian soldiers in the first days of large-scale war. Near his house, he was unarmed. He was civilian. I heard his wife Katerina in the court. She told that her husband was an ordinary farmer, but he was her whole universe. And she told to the judge that now I lost everything in my life. And this is the meaning of justice, that we have to invest all necessary efforts to investigate what happened with all people affected by this war, regardless their social position, who they are, the type of crime they endured, and whether or not media or international organizations interested in their cases. Because life of each person matters. And while this war turns people into the numbers, only justice can return people their name.
Well, Oleksandra, we've heard a lot about efforts to seize the frozen Russian assets for reparations, about the European Union, the Council of Europe's efforts to create a tribunal for aggression, and very dynamic domestic prosecutions for international humanitarian law violations, and even for ecocide and for environmental war crimes. Can you bring our listeners up to speed on where these, and then obviously the International Criminal Court indictment of President Putin and others? Can you bring our listeners up to speed on the current state of efforts to employ accountability, reparation, acknowledge the truth of Russia's war of aggression?
3 years ago, when Russia started large-scale war, in that exact days, I was in Kiev. I refused to evacuate, and with a part of my team, we continued our work on the ground. And when Ukrainian army liberated Kiev region, we immediately sent mobile groups to Bucha, to Matyzhin, to Vorzel, to Irpin, to other cities and settlements of the Kiev regions. And we were shocked because we found dead bodies of civilians scattered around the streets until the liberation of the cities. We found dead bodies of civilians in the gardens of their own households. We found dead bodies of civilians, men and women, with the hands tied under their back in mass graves. We found dead bodies of civilians, the whole families, with children in civilian cars who were deliberately shot while their parents tried to take their children from the danger zone. So we faced with enormous amount of crimes. And I remember very clearly that 3 years ago, I started to ask to myself, for whom do we document all these crimes for? Who will provide a chance for justice for all people affected by this war? Because we face with accountability gap, which have several dimensions. First, there is no international court which can prosecute Putin and top political leadership and high military command of the Russian state for the crime of aggression. But all the atrocities which we are documenting, it's result of their leadership decision to start such war. And that is why we must create a special tribunal on aggression to fill this accountability gap and to hold the people accountable for the crime of aggression and bring them to justice. And second dimension of the accountability gap. As I mentioned, we faced with enormous amount of crimes. Office of General Prosecutor officially registered more than 150,000 criminal proceedings. Can you imagine the burden of responsibility? Because we all know that International Criminal Court, it's important institutions and its activity in Ukraine, it's very essential, but still International Criminal Court will limit its investigation only to several selected cases. It means that 99% of everything which Russians committed in Ukraine, it will be a burden of responsibility of national legal enforcement system. And to investigate properly in accordance of all criteria of Article 6 of European Convention of Human Rights, 150,000 criminal proceedings, it's impossible, even for the best national system in the world. Ukraine doesn't have the best national system in the world. Ukraine needs help.
Oleksandra, you've outlined a fairly comprehensive approach to transitional justice, to accountability, the International Criminal Court, the Aggression Tribunal, and then these 150,000 cases. And myself and others at PLFG have worked quite closely with a number of Ukrainian prosecutors on environmental crimes and the prosecution of other war crimes as well, thinking through how to be most effective and efficient. One of the things that we're anxious about, however, is with these ceasefire negotiations and that at some point in the future, peace negotiations, that these efforts at accountability might be sidelined. We've seen this in so many peace negotiations around the world, this amnesty first, this impunity first type of approach. And it's rare to have a justice first approach in peace negotiations. What are your thoughts? Do you share my anxiety, or are you fairly confident that this notion of accountability and transitional justice is so deeply embedded that it won't be eroded by the peace process?
It's a very difficult question to answer, and I don't know what will be a future, but I know for sure that all this hell which we now face in Ukraine, it's result of total impunity which Russia enjoyed for decades. Because Russian troops committed horrible crimes in Chechnya, in Moldova, in Georgia, in Mali, in Libya, in Syria, in other countries of the world. They have never been punished. They believe they can do whatever they want. A year ago, my friends and colleagues from Russian Human Rights Center Memorial published a report, and they analyzed Russian tactics in Chechnya, in Syria, and in Ukraine, and they told, this is the same war crime playbook. The chain of wars, chain of crimes, and chain of impunity. So when we look to the situation through this perspective, we have a clear understanding that justice is precondition to peace in our part of the world, where Russia for decades used the war as a tool how to achieve its geopolitical interests, and for decades uses war crimes as the methods how to win this war. We must break the circle of impunity which Russia enjoyed for decades, not just for people in Ukraine, but in order to prevent a next Russian attack to the next nation.
Now, Alexander, what ideas do you have or suggestions do you have to break the cycle of impunity and to ensure that impunity, amnesty isn't woven into a peace agreement? Now, the International Criminal Court is outside of a peace negotiation process, so it can continue with the indictment, the prosecution of Putin and others. But oftentimes the government will come under intense pressure in a negotiation to grant amnesty or to do away with domestic prosecutions or other transitional justice mechanisms. What advice would you give to the international community and to the people of Ukraine? How can they best fight against this and stop justice being traded for peace?
My advice will be to look deeply what justice is about, because there is law, there is politics, and there is a gap. And very often politicians don't understand the real meaning of justice, and that is why they think only about short-term perspective. But when we speak about peace, we have to speak about sustainable peace, which means that we have to think about long-term perspective as well. And what politicians sometimes don't understand, they see justice as something which has influence to the past because you persecuted someone for something which has already been done, or they can also see justice as a tool how to influence the future, because you send a strong signal to the future that if you will commit something similar, you will also be persecuted. But what is important to understand that justice has a huge impact to present. Justice has power to strategically change reality. What do I mean? Russians have no doubt that they will never be persecuted because, as I mentioned before, they enjoyed impunity for decades. It's a long-lasting tradition. While Nuremberg trial tried Nazi war criminals, Soviet Gulag was never condemned or punished. So it's something in culture, this impunity ingrained. If we start a decisive legal actions, even if part of Russians start to be doubt that probably this time they will not avoid responsibility, this doubt will be converted in chilling effect to the brutality of human rights violations. And because we speak about ongoing war, it means that with this chilling effect, we can save thousands, thousands, and thousands of lives.
So breaking that cycle of impunity of at least 80 years, I guess one would say, by making it crystal clear that you can't negotiate away justice in any future process, that there will be accountability. It will break that cycle of impunity and that cycle of violence. Are you seeing any impact at the moment on the battlefield or the way in which the war is conducted because of the International Criminal Court indictments, the efforts of the Council of Europe to create a tribunal of aggression? It's obviously exceedingly difficult to measure, so it's just a guess. But do you have a sense that this full court effort, full court press by Ukraine for accountability and its allies is having an impact on the battlefield?
I'm not a military expert, and that's why it's very difficult for me to see this clear link, but I can tell you one story. When 2 years ago, International Criminal Court issued arrest warrant, it got a huge reaction among the top political leadership of Russia, because it was the first arrest warrant against President Putin and his child commissioner, Maria Lvova-Belova. And because we all know Russian language very well, we can follow how it was discussed in Russian TV. And in one Russian TV show, I saw the head of Russia Today, Margarita Simonyan, and she was furious. She was furious, but not because International Criminal Court issued arrest warrant, but because of reaction to this fact by Russian generals. She told, "Can you imagine? I just discussed this situation with several Russian generals, and they told me probably we have to change our military tactics because we will be the next who will be prosecuted by International Criminal Court." So she was very angry. She told, how can they be afraid of International Criminal Court? They have to be afraid just to lose this war. So it works. For sure, it not work for 100% for all Russian generals, but nobody knows what will be in future. And the history of humankind convincingly proved that authoritarian regime collapsed, and the leaders who see themselves untouchable can appear under the court. That's why fear is there.
And that fear starts to chill their propensity for committing war crimes or to erode their sense of impunity. Now, that's encouraging to hear because we oftentimes wonder, do these mechanisms of transitional justice have a meaningful impact? And it sounds like they are, to a degree, having a meaningful impact. Let's shift gears a little bit. Ukraine has been very innovative in its full court press application of accountability, transitional justice. One of the questions that always comes up in transitional justice is enough space being created for the voice of victims, for victims to be heard in these transitional justice processes. And I've heard very positive things about how the Ukrainians have involved witnesses, victims in their transitional justice processes. Can you share a little bit with our listeners about what the Ukrainians have been doing?
It's very
Focus.
important question how to use this human-centered approach in all political process which Ukraine is conducting. People who survived from the hell need to restore not just their broken life, broken families, broken vision of the future, but also their broken belief that justice is possible, even though delayed in time. And that is why, when in autumn 2022, all Ukrainian survey was conducted and people were asked what will be the most disappointment for you after the war will end, the 65% of people answered that the main disappointment for them will be impunity for Russian war crimes. So this demand for justice is not just demand from human rights organizations, it's demand from millions and millions of people. So returning to the current situation, recent weeks we heard a lot about natural minerals, NATO membership, Russia's territorial claims, geopolitical interest, even about Zelensky's youth. But we don't hear about people. We don't hear about justice. And it's not okay. We must return human dimension into all political process around the question how to stop this Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. Without human dimension, we can't reach sustainable peace.
Oleksandra, what are some of your ideas or suggestions for sustaining that engagement of the human dimension? Because as we've seen in other conflicts, justice can take quite some time, years, sometimes even decades. Now, one of the things that I always share with the pro bono clients we work with is the good news is there is a long arm of justice, and these mechanisms that are created will oftentimes secure the transfer of presidents, prime ministers at some future point in the time. Ceasefires and peace negotiations have a limited period of time within which they're negotiated, but justice sticks around. But the difficulty is sustaining international and domestic support for these institutions of justice. What ideas and thoughts do you have that you can share with our listeners about how Ukraine is thinking about it, sustaining this interest and this engagement?
This is the most documented war in human history. Not only because we are documenting war crimes in a real time, so we are not waiting for the time when the war will end. When large-scale war started, we united our efforts with dozens of organizations from different regions. We built national network of local documentators. We covered the whole country, including the occupied territories. And working together, only our civil initiative, which is called Tribunal for Putin Initiative, jointly documented more than 84,000 episodes of war crimes. 84,000 for civil initiative. It's enormous amount, but still it's just a tip of iceberg because Russia uses war crimes as the methods of warfare. But we are successful in documentation also because we live in new century. I mean, we have a digital tools which help us to document, to gather evidence, to restore what happened, to identify perpetrators, which we can't even dream 30 years ago during the Balkans War. The problem is that legal system is not developed so rapidly as digital technologies. And we have started this development with changing our mindset. Let me provide two examples. First, when I speak with top political leadership of different countries, I see that they still look to the world through the lens of the Nuremberg trial, where Nazi war criminals were tried only after Nazi regime had collapsed. And last century, it was an essential step to establish law and justice. But we live in new one. Justice is not privilege for winners. our historical task to make justice independent on the fact when and how the war will end. It means we cannot wait. We must establish a special tribunal on aggression now and hold Putin, Lukashenko, and their surrounding accountable. So first, we have to change our mindset, how we're thinking about the situation. And second, unfortunately, for the long period, it was taken like sad but normal that when you have wars or human rights crisis, because of the enormous amount of crimes, the majority of people has no chance to justice. We can challenge this norma. Once again, we technically equipped to challenge this norma and start just to try to track every individual cases, even when we have enormous amount of them. The work of Bellingcat, such organizations convincingly prove that in order to restore what happened, very often there is no necessity even to be in a spot. Another example, last year, we, together with International Federation for Human Rights, submitted a report to International Criminal Court. And we analyze the videos and speeches of top Russian propagandists. And we try to convince the court to open a new criminal proceedings because it's not just fake, it's crimes against humanity, what they're doing. If we have to read and to listen all the speeches and texts just by ourselves, it will take years just to read and to listen. Now it takes several minutes, just several minutes, and we get this abstract, which we can analyze as a human rights lawyers. So now we are technically equipped to change the global approach to war crime justice. And we can use Ukraine as a first precedent to do it and to go further. I think that all generation has their own historical goals when we speak about justice. And now it's our goal and obligations.
No, and it's been so impressive the degree to which Ukrainians have adopted technology in order to, gather the evidence, collect the testimony, to hold individuals accountable for atrocity crimes. Do you have a sense? So technology is, leapfrogged quite substantially. There is the International Criminal Court. There are efforts to create a tribunal for aggression. Do you have the sense that the international law itself, the rules that relate to the prosecution of atrocity crimes, holding those accountable for atrocity crimes, is that sufficient? Are there gaps? And as I mentioned, we've done quite a bit of work with Ukrainian prosecutors on ecocide and environmental war crimes. And Ukraine is working to fill a gap there that exists in international law. But generally speaking, is international law adequate, or should we also be working to evolve and improve?
For sure, we have to work on them. You mentioned ecocide. I can also mention another crime like genocide, because there is no necessity to be a lawyer to understand from the common sense that if you want to destroy partially or completely some national group, there is no necessity to kill all representatives of this group. You can just forcibly change their identity and you will reach your genocidal intent, because sooner or later, all national group will disappear. And we have to ingrain this dimension into UN Convention Against Genocide as well. So there are a lot of fields for future developments, but I think the main problem not even in these gaps. The problem is that the international order, which is based on UN Charter and international law, is collapsing before our eyes. This is a problem. That all existing international architecture of peace and security, which was created past century by victorious states, and this UN system coped more or less good with global challenges before, but now it's just stalling. It's reproducing ritualistic movements. This system has to be cardinal changed because the world has cardinal changed. And now we see the attempt of Russia, Iran, North Korea, China to replace the existing world order with their own vision. And that is why, even when we speak about Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, it's not just a war between two states. This is a war between two systems, authoritarianism and democracy. And for China, Iran, North Korea, and Russia, Ukraine is not just a goal, it's a tool how to break this existing international world order and to replace it with their own vision. And they doesn't propose nothing new for humankind. It's not new program. They just want to promote the idea that if you are strong, you can do whatever you want. If you have a strong country with a military potential, a nuclear weapon, you can break international rules. You can dictate your rules to entire international communities and even forcibly change the internationally recognized borders. So this is their vision. And this is the main problem for my point of view, that we can develop international law, but without changing the system which make this law into force, we will never succeed.
It's an attack. The Russian war of aggression against Ukraine is an attack on Ukraine, the people of Ukraine, the identity of Ukraine, but also on the existing global world order. And I'm glad that you made that link through Russia to North Korea, to China, to Iran. They want more of a free reign to operate around the globe without being constrained by international law or the global world order. Well, Oleksandra, let me ask you two more questions. You've been very generous with your time. My penultimate question is you get up every day, you fight for justice, for accountability. I imagine you can only do this if you're hopeful about the role that accountability might play in a durable peace and about the prospects for accountability and justice. Can you share with us a little bit about what inspires you to continually and to daily fight for accountability and justice? And should we have hope?
First, I feel a huge responsibility. I documenting stories of people who survived Russian captivity and personally interviewed hundreds of people. And they told me horrible stories, how they were beaten, raped, smashed into wooden boxes, their fingers were cut, their nails were torn away, they were electrically shocked through their own genitalia. One woman told me how her eye was dug out with a spoon. These men and women sometimes never tell about this horror to their families, but they tell their stories to me and my colleagues with a hope for justice. And it's a huge responsibility. And second, I decided to become a lawyer because when I was a child in a school, I got acquainted with Soviet dissident. And suddenly, I found myself in a circle of fantastic people with a special ethics, a people who say what they think and do what they say, who had bravery to stood up their voice against the entire totalitarian Soviet machine, who had no other tools but just their own words and their own position. And they were severely repressed. People were killed, jailed, subjected to forcible psychological treatment. The families were separated, their careers were ruined, but they didn't give up because they have human dignity and the special ethic, what the hope is about. Now I will return to a question. Hope for me means something very special. Hope it's not a confidence that everything will be fine, but this is a deep understanding that all our efforts have a huge meaning.
Now, Alexander, that's your thoughts on hope are inspirational because this work is that you and your colleagues do is exceedingly difficult, exceedingly taxing, but so necessary to bring the voice of the victims of Russian atrocities and the Russian war of aggression to the international community. And that provides wind in the sails, so to speak, of institutions and individuals seeking accountability for these atrocity crimes. Let me leave one last question is what one takeaway would you like our listeners to remember from this conversation? What is it that they need to carry with them forward and into the coming years from the conversation we're having?
I want our listeners to remember that even when you can't rely on the legal instruments, when you can't rely on the existing UN system of peace and security, you can still rely on people. Because ordinary people have a much great impact that they can even imagine. We get used to thinking in categories of states and interstates organizations, but people have power. People have power to change history. And that is why I look in future with optimism. I don't see that our near future will be easy. It will be difficult. It will be challenges, but still, the future is not just unclear, but also not pre-written. This means that we still have a chance to fight for future, which we want for us and for our children.
Oleksandra, I'm so glad you mentioned that because so many of our listeners are in the early stages of their career. They're studying, they're becoming educated about how they can utilize the tools that exist to make a difference and to build durable peace and to make the world a more peaceful place, and reminding them the power of people and not just institutions and laws. So thank you for sharing that. I'm hugely grateful for that inspiration. Oleksandr, it's been a real honor and a privilege to have this conversation, and I'm so grateful for you taking the time to talk with me and to share your thoughts and insights with our listeners on the role of accountability and building a durable peace in Ukraine, and in particular the necessity to hold those responsible for atrocity crimes, to hold them account. So thank you very much, and I'm a huge admirer of yours and the work that you do at the Center for Civil Liberties, and so grateful that there are individuals and like you and organizations like yours out there doing this work every single day to try to prevent and to punish atrocity crimes.
Thank you for support.